We often treat history as a series of unique, unpredictable events driven by individual free will. We gather dates, letters, and speeches, but we rarely look for the cold, mathematical laws that might govern how human societies actually move. Ecologist Peter Turchin began his career modeling something far simpler: the population explosions of pine beetles. By using supercomputers to chart where beetle populations would peak and decline, he developed a mathematical framework that he eventually applied to 10,000 years of human history. He called this new discipline cliodynamics. It uses the same structural equations used in biology to represent historical change, allowing researchers to test predictions against observable results rather than relying on speculation. The framework for this measurement is the secular cycle, a pattern lasting roughly 2 to 3 centuries. It tracks a state as it integrates, achieves prosperity, and eventually fragments under its own weight. If these demographic laws are consistent, we can evaluate the political instability of the 2020s not as a series of random accidents, but as a specific, predictable phase of the cycle. Every cycle begins with an expansion phase. In an agrarian society, as the population grows, it eventually hits the limits of what the land can provide. As the workforce nears the ceiling, the society faces a massive oversupply of labor. When there are more workers than jobs, bargaining power evaporates. As a result, real wages and worker purchasing power drop, while the price of basic necessities like food begins to climb. This creates a mechanism called the wealth pump. Because labor is cheap and land is scarce, the surplus generated by the economy flows into the hands of those who own the means of production. Through the Matthew principle, the rich use this extra income to buy up the remaining land of the poor, concentrating the nation's wealth at the top. In this model, extreme inequality is a mechanical byproduct of a population exceeding its resources. We then enter the stagflation phase. The concentrated wealth at the top creates an elite overproduction event. Because there is so much capital available to the upper class, the number of people competing for elite status swells twice as fast as the general population. As the number of elites grows, they begin to outspend each other to maintain their status. This ostentatious consumption burns through their wealth, and the individual resources available to each member of the elite start to decline. Eventually, there are far more elite aspirants than there are positions of power. To survive, these surplus elites turn to the state, seeking government jobs and patronage that drive up military and bureaucratic spending. The state is forced to increase spending even as its tax base, the impoverished commoners, is drying up. This leads to chronic deficit spending and eventual state insolvency. This insolvency causes the ruling class to fracture. The elite aspirants who fail to gain power become counter-elites. They have the education and the wealth to organize, and they begin to channel the genuine anger of the lower classes to destabilize the regime. In this model, societies don't collapse because of peasant revolts alone. They collapsed when elite factions used the desperation of the poor to wage war against their rivals. This challenges the popular view of biologists like Richard Dawkins, who argue that humans are naturally selfish and our cooperation is just an evolutionary mistake. Turchin adopts Ibn Khaldun's concept of asabiya, or group feeling. He argues that human groups are subject to multi-level selection. Groups that cooperate effectively survive, while those that prioritize internal competition are wiped out by their neighbors. Historically, this group feeling is forged on meta-ethnic frontiers, the intense friction points where two radically different civilizations meet. These environments demand total social cohesion, forcing tribes to unite into empires just to survive. When a society is integrated, modest inequality keeps everyone aligned toward a shared destiny. But as the wealth pump widens the gap, that mutual interest dissolves. The commoners feel no stake in a system that extracts their labor, and the elites become more focused on defeating their internal rivals than defending the collective. Once the social consensus is shattered by this mechanical breakdown of cooperation, the society loses its ability to coordinate against external threats or internal crises. This isn't just theory. The historical record supports it. When we plot the data for Rome, Plantagenet England, and Capetian France, the patterns of population, wages, and elite conflict mirror one another across centuries. In the early Roman Republic, the senatorial class was actually more likely to die in battle than the common citizen, which reinforced national solidarity. By the late Republic, the elite had switched to a predatory model, using slave labor to crush the small farmers who had been the backbone of the Roman army. In 14th century England and France, we see the same result. Populations tripled, real wages dropped to their lowest point in history, and the resulting elite fragmentation led to a century of internal war. The Black Death provides an accidental proof of the model. By causing a massive, rapid depopulation, it suddenly reversed the labor oversupply. Real wages for the surviving workers climbed immediately, and the standard of living for commoners actually improved. Even exceptions prove the rule. In Mamluk Egypt, the ruling elites were military slaves who were not allowed to pass their status to their children. Because this structurally prevented elite overproduction, they avoided the standard cycle of state breakdown for centuries. Across thousands of years, these same structural demographic patterns appear in the data before the collapse of centralized power. The disintegrative phase only ends through a process called the pruning of the elites. Civil war and famine physically reduce the ranks of the overproduced nobility until the ratio of elites to commoners is restored. Those who survive these periods of chaos are often inoculated against radicalism. They have seen the price of social breakdown, which allows a new consensus to form and a new integrative cycle to begin. Collapse is a brutal, self-correcting mechanism that resets the relationship between a society's population and its governance. To understand our own era, we have to look at the four elite groups that manage a modern state: the military, the ideological, the administrative, and the plutocratic. Modern Egypt provides a recent example of a military-dominated elite. The Arab Spring was the result of a classic youth bulge, a generation of university graduates who found no jobs in the system and joined with the poor to challenge the regime. In the United States, the plutocratic elite is dominant. In the late 1970s, the wealth pump was turned back on through specific policy shifts, causing GDP to keep growing while worker wages remained flat. This has created the same elite overproduction we see in history. We now have a glut of ultra-wealthy individuals and underemployed law graduates, all vying for a limited number of political and economic positions. These frustrated aspirants have emerged as counter-elites. They have the resources to fracture the political consensus, and they are using the stagnation of the working class to challenge the existing order. The result is a mechanical breakdown of asabiya. Internal conflict, the erosion of norms, and rising social turbulence are the predictable outcomes of this demographic math playing out in real time. But history shows this trajectory isn't destiny. In the 1930s, American elites looked at the depth of the Great Depression, and they voluntarily accepted the New Deal. By turning off the wealth pump and restoring worker power, they forestalled a revolution. We are currently in a disintegrative phase that follows a well-documented mathematical pattern. But because we can measure these variables, we have the opportunity to change them and decide how the equation ends.